What's going on, everybody? Kalipis Tech here, coming back at you with another video. This is pros and cons for the Motorola Moto G Stylus 2022. In this video, I'm going to be giving you some of the strengths and weaknesses of this phone to help you decide whether or not it's the right one for you. Now, if you want to learn more about this phone, be sure to check out my full review and tips and tricks videos for it as well. And for your convenience, I will be linking to this phone in the video description, so be sure to check that out for the latest info on pricing and availability, because this is always changing. But with that being said, let's get started. So my first pro for this phone is the storage. With this phone, we're getting 128 gigabytes of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so that's definitely a lot of storage. In this day and age, even if you don't do a whole lot with your phone, it's really a good idea to have more storage than you think you need, because things are getting larger and larger, from the system to apps and just data in general. I mean, taking a look at the storage on this phone right now, as you can see, I'm taking up 33.45 gigabytes of space. In this system, by far takes up the most space at 20 gigabytes. So that really just goes to show that if this phone had like 32 gigabytes or even 64 for that matter, it really wouldn't be nearly enough. And of course, another great thing about this phone is the microSD card expansion, because if you're a power user, if you have lots of photos and videos and stuff like that, you can expand the storage even more to fit more stuff on the phone. Now, the reason the microSD card expansion is such a great thing with this phone is that we're really getting into the mid-range here. This phone does have some nice performance and really nice features. And while performance-wise, it might not be exactly comparable to a flagship phone, the microSD card expansion is a huge advantage it has over those higher-end phones, because most of them, like for example, the Samsung Galaxy S21 FE, don't have microSD card expansion. In fact, I don't even know of a single brand new flagship phone that actually has microSD card expansion. Now, granted, those phones do have other variants with insane amounts of storage, like the iPhone 13 Pro Max, for example. You can get up to a terabyte, but that's a $1,400 phone versus this phone that's only around $300. So it really goes to show that with this phone, you get a lot of value, having not only a ton of internal storage as it is, but also the ability to expand it a lot more with a microSD card if you ever need to. My second pro for this phone is the battery. Now, with the Moto G Stylus 2022, we're getting a 5,000 milliamp hour battery that supports 10-watt fast charging. So that 10-watt fast charging is really nice. It's not the strongest fast charging I've seen, but it definitely does make a difference, especially if you need to charge up your phone quickly. But then again, provided you actually charge your phone every night, the chances of this phone dying when you need to use it are pretty low, because with a 5,000 milliamp hour battery, this phone, especially when you first get it, can last for multiple days without being charged. So if battery life is your number one priority, or even one of your priorities in general, this is definitely something to keep in mind, because that's one of this phone's biggest strengths. My third pro for the Moto G Stylus 2022 is the camera. So I'm going to give you a quick rundown of the camera setup. We got a hole punch for the front-facing camera, and this camera is 16 megapixels. And then for the rear setup, we got a triple camera with a 50 megapixel main camera, an 8 megapixel ultra-wide camera that doubles as a macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera for portrait mode. So as far as features go, this phone pretty much has everything. Whether you want to get wide shots for scenery, really close-up detailed images, some nice portrait photos for Instagram or something like that, or just really high quality photos in general, this phone can pretty much do it all. And what's especially interesting about this phone is the ultra-wide camera that doubles as a macro camera. You don't see that every day. In fact, this is the only phone I've ever seen that has that setup. Motorola's website goes into more detail about how this works, but essentially, it's basically just two camera features combined into one. And I will say, both the ultra-wide camera and the macro camera do take good photos. To give you an idea of what this camera can do, here are some photos taken with the main camera. As you can see, they're real high quality photos. So really, no matter what you're taking photos for, this phone is definitely going to get the job done. Overall, I really like how the camera captured the colors, the details are really sharp, and the lighting looks pretty good too. Now here are some photos taken with the ultra-wide camera. Same kind of thing, really good quality. And one thing I really appreciate about this ultra-wide camera is that there's really not that much distortion around the edges, because a lot of the time, even with high-end ultra-wide cameras, you do get a little distortion and loss of quality, but with this phone, we're really not seeing much of that. This is a photo taken with portrait mode. Again, same thing, really nice quality photo. So if you're taking photos for, say, Instagram, for example, portrait mode is really popular with social media, then this phone will definitely get the job done. Now here's a photo taken with a macro camera. As you can see, it's a really close-up, detailed image, just like a macro camera should be. So again, if you like macro cameras and want to take this kind of photo, the Moto G Stylus 2022 will definitely get the job done. Now my fourth pro for the Motorola Moto G Stylus 2022 is the display. With this phone, we're getting a 6.8-inch 90Hz IPS LCD display with a resolution of 1080p, a PPI of 396, an aspect ratio of 20.5:9, and a screen-to-body ratio of about 84.6%. So these are some real nice specs, especially for a mid-range phone. The 1080p display looks really nice, the image is super sharp, so whether you're viewing photos, watching videos, playing a game, it's all gonna look really good on this phone. And not only that, but of course, as you can see here, the display is really large, so things are gonna show up, of course, larger on here, and it's all gonna be easier to see, so content consumption is gonna be more comfortable in general. This is especially good for reading, because of course, who doesn't want a larger display when you're trying to read words? And another cool thing about this phone is it has a slightly taller form factor at 20.5:9 versus the 20:9 aspect ratio we got with the Moto G Stylus 2021. Now of course, with this taller form factor, you're gonna get a little bit more space on the phone, so if you're reading something, you'll be able to fit more stuff on the screen and you won't have to scroll as much. And if you're watching videos in landscape mode, it's gonna look a little nicer as well. Overall, the colors and general brightness do look really good on this display. I have the brightness at 100% right now, and I am impressed, especially compared to some other mid-range phones that are pretty dim. Now, the viewing angles aren't amazing per se, but again, for a phone in this price range, it's really not that bad. Another cool thing about this phone is the 90Hz display. This is going to make movement on the screen a little bit faster and smoother, making it feel a little bit more premium when you're navigating through the phone. And when you're consuming content, it's going to look a little nicer as well. So overall, if you want a phone with a nice display, the Moto G Stylus 2022 is going to be a good option. My fifth pro for this phone is the general features. Now this phone doesn't quite have Android 12 yet, it probably will sometime soon, but right now we are on Android 11. But that being said, Motorola's Android skin is actually really nice. It's really simple, doesn't have a whole lot of bloatware, and we get a lot of cool features. Like for example, we have not one, but two extra shortcuts for the camera. You can double tap the power key, or you can just go like this, and you can do this when the phone's locked too. We got a shortcut for the flashlight, and even a more convenient way to take screenshots. Now these are really little things, but considering that other phones not only don't have features like this, but also have a ton of bloatware that takes up space on the phone and slows down the performance in general, I really do prefer Motorola's Android skin over a lot of others. So now that we've gone over some of the good things about this phone, let's go over some of the drawbacks. My first con for this phone is the processor. With this phone, we are getting 6GB of RAM with the MediaTek Helio G88 processor. Now before I go into why this isn't really the best, I will say it is nice to see this phone getting 6GB of RAM since the Moto G Stylus 2021 only had 4. But that being said, I did run a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on this phone, and it came back with a single core score of 368 and a multi-core score of 1304. Now you can take this with a grain of salt because these scores don't really mean a whole lot by themselves without anything to compare them to, but I will say this is actually quite a bit slower than the Moto G Stylus 2021, so we're seeing a downgrade here. And then just compared to the general expectation of a phone like this, I do think it should be a little faster because after all, I expect new phones to be a little bit more powerful, if not the same at the very least. So seeing this was definitely a disappointment. But that being said, for basic activities like sending text messages, making calls, browsing the web, going on social media, this phone has done decently well and I haven't had any performance issues. Now what I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and comparing the numbers to these to see if this phone would actually be an upgrade for you, because while it is a downgrade from the Moto G Stylus 2021, it might still be an upgrade from your current phone. So definitely run the test, compare the numbers to these, and if this phone would be an upgrade, then this might not actually be a drawback for you. My second con for this phone is that there's no NFC. Now, in case you don't know what it is, NFC is the technology behind contactless mobile payment services like Google Pay. Now, in this day and age, these features are becoming more and more popular and widely used, and we're starting to find NFC in more and more mid-range phones as time goes on. In fact, the Samsung Galaxy A13 5G, for example, which is actually slightly cheaper than this phone, does have NFC, and this phone doesn't. So Motorola honestly really is behind in that regard, because while it's one thing for the phone not to have the feature when mostly flagship phones had it, now that we're really starting to see it in lots of mid-range phones, I'm really starting to expect the feature in phones in this price range. My third con for this phone is that there's no wireless charging. Now this one is actually a little bit more nitpicky because lots of phones in this price range don't have wireless charging. In fact, I want to say most of them don't. But I do know from other budget phones that do have wireless charging that this isn't just some crazy feature that costs a lot to implement. In fact, phones like the Cricket Dream 5G that's around half the price of this phone and the Visible Midnight that's around a third of the price of this phone do have wireless charging. So I know it's not just a flagship phone feature. So looking at a lot of these mid-range phones that have higher quality features like 90Hz displays, really nice camera setups, lots of shortcuts and stuff like that, I really don't get why these phones can't have wireless charging and other really cheap phones do. And it's not like the wireless charging in these lower end phones is bad by any means, it's really not. For that matter, I've charged the Visible Midnight, which is only a $100 phone, almost exclusively on a wireless charger. I don't think I've ever once plugged it in since I got it, and it actually charges really quickly. So in general, while only a handful of phones that aren't flagship phones have wireless charging, I know it's possible to implement it in these mid-range phones, so I really don't get why they haven't done it. Now my fourth con for this phone is the stylus. Now you might be wondering, this phone is literally named after the stylus. Why would this be a con? Well, I don't think the stylus in and of itself is a con necessarily, but I do think it could be a lot better. And for a phone called the Moto G Stylus, I feel like there should be at least some advantage to using it. Honestly, taking a look at what the stylus can do, it's really not that sensitive. I mean, if you wanted to do any type of actual art on this, I don't really think you could. So compared to something like the Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra, this stylus is really barely usable. I mean, it's a little bit more sensitive than its previous models, but still at the same time, I really don't see that much of a point in it. I guess if you just like to use it for navigating and stuff like that, it can be a little bit more convenient. Or if you wanted to use the coloring book for a kid to play with or something like that. But in general, while it's kind of cool, I guess, and there's no drawback to actually having the stylus itself, I really don't see very much tangible value in it. And I do think if they made it at least a little bit more sensitive, it could be a lot better. My fifth and final con for the Motorola Moto G Stylus 2022 is the video capabilities. Now with this phone, it does cap out at 1080p in both the rear and the front cameras, so it's really nothing special, and normally I wouldn't really think anything of it. But the Motorola Moto G Stylus 2021 was able to shoot in 4K in the rear camera, so that's another one of the downgrades we're seeing with this phone, and it is a little disappointing that they actually took that feature away, because nowadays, having at least the option to shoot in 4K is always a nice thing. But those were my pros and cons for the Motorola Moto G Stylus 2022. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I hope you found this information useful as well. If you did, don't forget to leave a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. And once again, if you want to learn more about this phone, be sure to check out my full review and tips and tricks videos for it as well. And again, I will be linking to this phone in the video description, so for the latest up-to-date info on pricing and availability, definitely check out that link because this is always changing, especially with a newer phone like this. But that's it for this video. As always, I will see you in the next one.